Are you considering managing your own investment property, or have you considered what you need to ask a property manager if you need to get a property manager to look after your property for you? Well, today we're going to answer all your questions. I'm here live with Emma from Turner Real Estate. I'm, of course, Marissa from Rise High, and thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about what you need to consider if you're planning on managing your own investment property or you're currently managing your own investment property. But we're also going to be talking about when we should be looking at getting a professional property manager and what they do and what you need to look out for. So Emma is quite an expert in this area. Turner Real Estate, I think, are one of the largest.
Yes, we are the largest.
Independently owned property management firm in Adelaide, is that right?
Yeah, we manage over 3,000 properties all across Adelaide.
So clearly pretty experienced to talk to us about this topic.
I hope so.
So I guess I'll get into it because, you know, as a property investor, it is hard to know whether you should manage your investment properties yourself or appoint a property manager. I must admit, from my perspective, I've always been a lazy investor and I've loved just having a property manager look after everything for me. But there are some people in our client base who do like to look after their own properties. So what I'm hoping to do today is to give you guys some really good insight as to what you should be looking for if you are looking to manage it yourself, but also when you should be considering a professional property manager and what advantages a professional property manager might bring. So let's just talk about the things really that you have to do, generally speaking, to manage a property. I mean, obviously there's the obvious ones of finding a tenant, collecting the rent, and, you know, managing maintenance. I guess. But it's a bit broader than that, isn't it? There's a bit more to it than just those three things.
Well, the Residential Tenancies Act applies equally to both agents and private landlords. So whether you're doing it yourself or you've got a professional on board, all of those obligations still exist. Now, the Residential Tenancy Act is fairly substantial, and there are a lot of sort of compliance pieces that need to be in place. But I mean, some of the day-to-day things is making sure that the tenant's got an up-to-date rent ledger that needs to be accurate at all times, issuing receipts to the tenants, making sure that the property is kept in a safe and inhabitable conditions, so those routine inspections. When a tenancy starts, there's a lot of setup involved, vetting the tenant, making sure that you're storing all that data, collecting bonds, lodging that with Consumer and Business Services, and doing an ingoing inspection. So the ingoing inspection, when done by a professional, probably takes 3 to 4 hours, depending on the size of the property. So we know what to look for in all of those things, and we'll produce you with a report of a couple of hundred photos as well as a written report as well. And that's just to establish the tenancy. So there's lots that goes on behind the scenes, and I guess when you've got someone dedicated, paid full time to do that and have your property in their portfolio, it takes the headache away from you, because it's all good until it's not.
That's right. I was just going to say, you know, looking after your own property is pretty easy when things go smooth. When things are smooth sailing. But you know, what I've noticed is that often people that look after their own investment properties, you know, if they do end up having a good tenant that just stays for a really long time, then they may not actually be getting the market rent, because they may not be doing those like rent increases over time to match market. And then in situations where the tenant's not so good, which is possible, then obviously they end up in a bit of strife. You also mentioned, you know, vetting the tenants. Can you just explain what the process should be for someone managing their own property? Like, you know, it'd be good to understand what your process is from a vetting tenant's perspective, so that, you know, landlords that are thinking of self-management are seeing if their process is as thorough, because we all know that selecting a good tenant is really important. And of course, even with all of the vetting processes that you can go through, sometimes you still will get it wrong, but at least if you've gone through all the checks and balances, you've got more chance of having a good quality tenant. So
absolutely, so the application process is a really lengthy process and time consuming for property management, but a really important part of it, and the time spent there should set the tenancy up well. So we will check the identity of all of the people that wish to reside in the property and wish to be on the tenancy. We'll verify income levels, so you'll need to collect privacy statements from the tenant to ensure that you have that authority to ring their employer. And also...
So you collect like pay slips, ring the employer, you look at their ID.
And also doing rental references is really important as well. And often if there's just multiple private landlords listed, that can be a bit of a red flag. So as an agency, we actually have processes to verify that that landlord does own the property and it's not just their mum or their best friend trying to get them into the property. So those are phone calls verifying that the agent did actually manage a property for them, finding out what the details of that were during the tenancy, what their routine inspections were like and what their tenancy arrears are.
And what happens in the case of someone that hasn't previously rented a property and they don't have, you know, rental referees that you can call on?
And we see that all the time. I mean, obviously everybody has to have a start, or sometimes people move out of family home for differing reasons, and experienced property managers will actually have a lot of empathy for that. So I have a lot of senior property managers, and they often sit down with the younger ones and say, look, I'm really keen to give you a go, but we're going to do routine inspections a little more regularly up front so we can build the confidence and check that you understand what a tenancy looks like and how to maintain that and build that confidence. So it is sometimes harder to get that first property, particularly when the market's at its peak.
And I guess you don't really know. I mean, how do you really know if a prospective tenant is actually being honest, that they've never rented before?
Well, that's true,
or just trying to hide a bad rental referee from a previous rental. Like, how can you be sure about that?
Well, agents also have access to tenancy databases that have, if there's a court order against you.
Secret databases that...
No, it's not too secret. No, we pay a subscription and they adhere to the Privacy Act. And
but is that something that privately, like landlords that manage their properties themselves, can they get access to that?
I'm sure they could, but probably the cost for them as a once-off would be significant. So there's very strict
So what are the databases that you have access to?
Yeah, so that would mean that if you left the property and you left significant debt on the property, so tenancy arrears, perhaps hadn't paid your water, had done significant damage, we can only put you on that tenancy database after we've been to the relevant authority, which here in South Australia is SACAT, and they verify that that debt is real and the tenant fails to pay it. So it's very strict. It's not a secret database, but it's one that tends to be utilised more so from property management.
What's the name of that database?
Oh, there's several.
Oh, there's several. So you just subscribe to lots of them?
Yeah, so most agencies will subscribe to one or two, and there's a bit of sort of data amongst those as well, but also the trust amongst property management agents as well. Of course, you know, giving honest references works both ways when they need to come back there. So a lot of that becomes uncovered as well there, as far as were they in rental arrears and were they in invoice arrears and what were their routine inspections like. So they're important parts of the reference checking.
I also know that in South Australia there's a pretty close-knit, you know, the property management community is pretty close-knit in the sense that Adelaide's not very big from that perspective. And so if a tenant has done the wrong thing, it can get around the property management circles pretty...
Yeah, well also I suppose these days like listing addresses is fairly easy to Google for us, so if they're saying that they haven't rented for the last few years, it immediately raises questions, where have they lived? So a bit of Googling can often uncover different things as well.
And if you Google their previous address and that was a rental, then that's
and I mean we wouldn't be ringing somebody without that authority, but we'd be going back to the applicant and asking them why they hadn't listed that. So you know, it's not just of course using Google, but also sort of getting to the bottom of why those people may not be listed there.
And you talked about the Act. Obviously the Act governs what, you know, tenants and landlords' responsibilities are and obligations. And I think that, you know, let's be honest, most people that manage the properties themselves may not necessarily have as thorough understanding of the Act as a professional property manager who does it every day.
Absolutely.
What are the big areas that people could potentially fail or mishap if they don't really understand parts of the Act properly? You know, what are the big red flags that you would be worried about to think, well, these are the areas that you would see people potentially failing if they didn't have a good understanding of the Act?
Well, often when we've taken over self-managed properties, people have found it's just got a little bit beyond their time commitment, or things have started to go a bit awry. So things that we find is a very poor ingoing inspection report. Everything will be ticked as good or whatever, and then the tenant will say no, it wasn't, and there'll be a dispute about whether that was given back to the landlord in a timely fashion. So straight away, the condition of the property is very hard to establish, and 2 years later, that's really tricky. Where if you've got one that's been prepared professionally, it's typed up, it's acknowledged by the tenant. The tenant's
photos of everything.
That's right, photos of everything. So they're really big things.
Yes,
often
that's a good one.
People let the rent ledger and payment dates get a little bit beyond them as well, and then we'll find that the tenant has one set of dates and they're trying to download bank accounts, which isn't a receipt, but they're obviously trying to help us understand when they've paid, and the landlord isn't quite sure. So making up rent ledgers backwards is not great either, and is certainly not legal. So, you know, that can be a problem. So the paid to dates become very confused. Regular routine inspections, they often just don't happen, particularly over time if somebody's been there.
And they're so important, because sometimes, you know, sometimes tenants that pay their rent on time, and you sort of think, well, everything's going well, and you might speak to them on the phone, you're like, oh, well, they're probably going fine, but then you realise that they've been, you know, growing drugs in the property or doing, you know, something.
Well, certainly, I think most experienced property managers have seen everything, that's for sure. But it's also the other obligation that the landlord has to keep the property safe. So if you've got a really easygoing tenant, and perhaps, you know, it's someone that doesn't get up on the roofs and cleans the gutters and things like that, those things can, you know, really require maintenance and be easily forgotten. So, you know, things rotting, perhaps a little bit of mould getting out of control, and tenants not too fussed about it, respects that the landlord's, you know, being easygoing with them, and then suddenly at the end of the tenancy, it's a big problem for the landlord to solve. Particularly things like moisture can cause thousands and thousands of dollars of damage. And
that's such a good point, because if you don't actually do the little maintenance along the way regularly, then you just can potentially be left with a massive problem to fix, whereas it would have been a lot cheaper potentially if you just dealt with the little problems as they came along.
That's right. And then if the tenant continues to report it and the landlord isn't investigating those, then that has its own sort of problems as well. So definitely doing that regular maintenance, and that's the purpose of an ingoing as well. It's not just to check on the tenant, it's actually to check on the condition of the property. So the tenant's enjoying the standard of living that they've signed up for, and the landlord's property is being well looked after as well.
We had a question come through, or a comment. I'm just trying to read it. Just what was the news report? ABT property used as tipping site for free firewood. Not sure what that comment's about, but
might have been perhaps the tenants moved out and left things on the side of the road. That does happen a lot.
Oh, well, fair enough.
We have to counsel tenants that when the end of the tenancy, it needs to be removed in a timely fashion. So sometimes there isn't the ability for hard rubbish to come in a council within a couple of days, so they may be responsible for that. Perhaps they'd cut down some trees and was just simply trying to get rid of it as quickly as possible.
And also tenants can often leave, you know, when they leave the property, they can leave furniture and all sorts of things behind, and then you've got the challenge
of... regularly do. We have to dump it.
You know, and then you have the challenge of, well, can you get rid of it straight away? Do you need to keep it for a certain amount of time?
That's right.
I mean, I know that's happened to me in my properties. So and that's probably a difficult situation to know how to handle if you're managing the property yourself. So what's the, you know, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, the Residential Tenancies Act governs that if the cost of moving the abandoned goods off-site and storing them is less than the cost of sort of disposing, that the property manager or of course the landlord can remove those. Now that's a very, very loose definition.
Yeah.
So some people will say, but I paid $2,000 for that couch, and you know, what's the value now? So determining the value of those items is often really tricky and a really stressful situation for property managers, but of course we need to still do it. But yeah, we have access to, I suppose, better tools and tradespeople to be able to assess those things and make a call on it when it needs to happen. Often people just don't want the couch and they leave it there. It's more and they say, oh, the next tenant can have it. So we sort of need to work with that tenant saying, no, it is your responsibility because it is your property, and usually we can organise someone fairly quickly to pick it up, and of course that would be at the tenant's cost. But things like that are often left at properties, you're right, and sometimes people do it in good faith hoping they'll appreciate that table or whatever, but the new tenant may not appreciate it.
You said that you've taken over a lot of properties that have been self-managed previously, and it just has been, you know, too much for them individually. Particularly with those people that have tried self-management and then moved to a property manager, what are the real benefits or reasons that you see that they make that change, and the benefits that come out of that for them in terms of making that transition?
Yeah, I suppose there's probably two groups that we see. One is that something's really gone wrong and they're in over their head and they need us to assist with the wind up of the tenancy.
Yeah.
And they don't want to try it again, so we'll go on. So generally we'll come in right at the end where the tenancy is already pretty broken between the landlord and tenant, and probably work through that final process, bond wind up, and sort of help the landlord understand their obligations and the tenant theirs to bring forward some sort of mutual agreement. But also we get that people are just sick of getting bugged at different times of day and night about maintenance, and they just want everything on a nice clean statement. They just want a payment once or twice a month with all of the bills attached, end of year summary, and that communication with the tenant just being completely
separate.
Out of so you can put a real line there, because I suppose it is hard, particularly if you know somebody. So often we manage properties for family members and they just don't want that to be awkward at family dinners or at gatherings or things like that. So
that's a really good point.
It's not necessarily that the tenancy's gone poorly, it's just people want to be released of that obligation and time.
I know that for me that's one of the big advantages. Like I said before, you know, I enjoy being a lazy investor in the sense that you just let your investment properties sit there, you collect, you know, the property manager's doing their thing, looking after everything, sorting everything out, and, you know, depositing money into your bank account every month, and it's actually quite nice. Just to know
it's a little
that
less emotive, I guess.
It's a little less emotive, and also, you know, we all live time poor lives. It gives you time to focus on the things that you enjoy rather than focusing on those sorts of things.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, often sort of longer term tenants, as a private landlord, you might get along really well with that person, and so you're less inclined to increase the rent. Lease extensions aren't done annually because date is missed, and so it just kind of rolls on to periodic, where a good agency should have systems and structures that can't happen. So the rent is reviewed annually, and of course even through an agency you're always inclined to keep a good tenant, but you're probably keeping speed a little more with market rent than private landlords, and we tend to see that as a pattern as well.
You just touched on periodic leases, so it probably is a good segue to talk about different types of leases, because you know, what are the different lease options and different types of leases that landlords and tenants can consider, you know, if they want to establish something moving forward?
Yeah, well, generally most people will, as tenants, will be seeking a 12-month tenancy, occasionally 6 months, and most times the landlord will want that as well. There's a lot of really important points to consider in fixed-term leases regarding insurances and how the Act sort of protects both landlord and tenant in that situation. So a lot of the time we do find that even private landlords will use the CBS documentation as a standard lease agreement, but around that renewal time it's simply forgotten. So rather than reviewing the rent and signing an ongoing commitment, it slips into what we call a periodic lease.
And what does a periodic lease mean? Can you just explain that to the audience?
So there's kind of pros and cons for both parties depending on your circumstances. But For a landlord that certainly wants a tenant to stay for a longer period of time, and a tenant that's looking for that stability, because of course it's really stressful to move, and they want to make sure the kids are in the local school for a long time and all those types of things. So it gives the certainty of a fixed term. Without that, if it falls into periodic, the landlord can give 90 days, but the tenant can give even less notice as well. So,
so how much?
A month or 21 days.
So the landlord has to give 90 days, but the tenant only has to give
21. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or
that
a month, depending
seems
on
a bit
how
unfair.
Well, that I suppose is really important for people to consider. And often if people have been renting something because they're building or they're waiting on a work thing, and they've had a really good tenancy, landlord is usually happy to accept that because they've had a good couple of years from that tenant. But you don't want that to kind of happen unintentionally. We always recommend that periodic agreements only exist for a very specific purpose, and there's uncertainty on both sides that both parties are comfortable with.
Are there any other downsides to periodic leases as opposed to fixed leases? Like when it comes to insurance?
There are, and the way that different insurance companies may cover rent losses and things will vary significantly. So they're also important to consider.
So are there any benefits of periodic leases to the landlord?
No. Not really to the tenant either in many cases, because people are, as a tenant, they generally want that stability. So we never get the question, oh, can I just set this up on a periodic lease? It's only at the end of a tenancy where there's a specific reason.
Okay, no, that sounds good. We've had another question come through. Is there a term for property managers? Can I switch now? So I'm assuming that means that they've got an agreement with a current property manager that they're not happy with. What is the process to change property managers? Can you go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. So landlords will have an agreement with a property management company, and that will be for initial term. So ours is 12 months. Some people have longer. And after that, it will either be a renewal, as in a set date, or it will continue with a period of notice. So they just need to check their management agreement to check whether they're A, in that initial period, and B, whether what the term is, whether it's 30 days or 90 days.
If they're not sure what they're looking for in that agreement to really work out what their obligations are, is that something that you would normally help
absolutely. We're always
landlords
happy to review that.
Like review their existing agreement to give them some advice as to what what the penalty would be. So if let's say that they were really unhappy with their property manager and they were actually within that initial term that they signed up for, what would be the process? Is there a cost to exit during that initial period?
Well, again, I suppose it depends if that contract has been fulfilled. So if the client felt that the property management agency simply wasn't fulfilling their appointed role under the Residential Tenancies Act and has, compromised that in some way, that is probably worthy of a discussion as well. Most people change through simply giving the notice period. So even in that initial term, there is the ability to change, just have to give a notice period? So it will be for a set initial period. But if you were unhappy during that period, I would definitely be recommending that you speak with the agency and the responsible department manager or principal about your concerns. You shouldn't simply just wait that out, because they may even be able to make a change internally within the team. There may be an issue.
And what if you've had the discussion and you're still not happy and you still want to leave, but you're within that term? What are your options as a landlord?
Well, I guess you would perhaps call the Real Estate Institute and have a chat to them about your concerns as to whether that might be a breach of the agreement, and that may be cause to terminate, or whether you would be bound by that. We're always like, if you're not happy, that's like, but we don't get that much either. So I think if you're open and honest,
it seems strange that
if something goes wrong,
a property management firm would keep you locked in when clearly you're unhappy with what's going on. So
absolutely.
So what's the process of becoming a property manager? So we've talked about professional property managers. Do they require some sort of special training, some sort of license? What makes you a professional property manager as opposed to not being a professional property manager?
Well, I suppose there's probably two parts to that, Marissa. One is you do need to be licensed with Consumer and Business Affairs.
Yep.
So they prescribe a set amount of training that you must successfully pass and then maintain a license. I guess at Turner we know that it's more than a course. It's also a lot of life experience as well. So we only have property managers that we build through experience. So we do take new people into the industry, but they don't complete the property management role for about 2 years, and even then it's heavily under supervision. So I think a really important thing for people
So I think that's probably quite unique to you, because I think that a lot of property management firms don't actually have very experienced property managers.
Yeah, or the training ability to supervise.
Yeah, so having like super experienced property managers is obviously a real advantage.
Yeah, and also asking how long the tenure of the property managers is as well. That's really important to us, and actually pretty unique in property management. It is a really stressful job.
Yes.
People have a lot of crazy things happen in their life, and sometimes through no fault of their own, and we're there to help them through that. So it is a fairly highly strung role, and and having the supported team, people you can laugh and sometimes cry about it as well, and get that advice and problem solve with when it's really tricky is also really important too. So checking that, if the property manager's away, who looks after the portfolio. We have permanent relief people that do that, so whether they're suddenly away or planned, there's always someone there that can step in with just as much experience and continue to look after it.
You've just touched on a couple of things that people should be asking for when they're looking for a good property management firm. I'd like to drill into that a bit deeper and say, well, if we do have listeners or viewers today that actually do want to find a new property manager to look after their investment properties, how should they go about finding the right one for them, and what sort of questions should they be asking to find the right property manager to suit their portfolio and their goals?
Yeah, well, definitely asking about that experience and who's going to be managing my property, what's the backup if that person's on annual leave or they suddenly become unwell or their children are unwell, who's going to support it then, who do I go to if I'm not happy, understanding that support team. How often do you conduct routine inspections? Do I get pictures in my ingoing inspections? Do I get pictures at my routine inspections? Can I come with you to the routine inspections? We really encourage our owners to attend maybe once every couple of years or maybe once a year. So they have a really good understanding of what's going on in the property, because often that little shrub that you planted many years ago is now 12 foot tall. So just seeing that for yourself, I think, is really good as well. And we don't have to advertise that you're the owner either, but just sort of keeping passively involved, I think, is really important too. So just understanding really how the agency works, and asking for reviews, looking on Google for reviews.
That's a good point.
Another really good one, and understanding that the tenants are treated well as well. Is really important, because when you get
is important.
When you get a high tenancy turnover, it's usually because people won't action maintenance and the tenants are hitting a dead end, and they'll simply move on, particularly when there's a bit more stock on the market.
I think the tenant turnover and the property management turnover is a signal or a sign.
That's right.
For the quality of care that you're going to get as a landlord.
Yeah, when everybody feels really confident and settled in the tenancy, it's usually a really positive experience, and that has to be set up properly.
I know for me also, I've always liked to look for an agency that has a really serious focus on property management. So they might have a sales arm as well, but property management is a really important business component in their business, because there are a lot of agencies out there where it is predominantly focused on sales, and they have a little property management arm tacked on with not a lot of focus. So for me, that's an important element as well.
Yeah, well, I think asking those questions about who's involved in the agency, looking on their website, looking for the team leaders, department managers, senior property managers, and a few people, and understanding the length they've been there will usually give the clues.
And generally the fee structure around property management is a percentage of...
That's right, management.
A percentage of the rental income.
The rental, and also water invoicing is another thing we do as well. So that management fee is generally on all monies collected.
So, I mean, how much variance do you find across the board there is on that sort of management fee in terms of comparing, property manager A to property manager B to property manager C? What would sort of that how much variance is there between that range of fees? Because I sort of drive around, I see all these like signs of these really, cheap property management fees, and it does to me seem like it varies quite a bit across the board.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you as to how much variation you see in the market, because you probably know a lot more about it than me, and where you think, where some agencies are really just charging dirt cheap management fees, how that, is that a worthwhile proposition for people to consider, or what are the things that they should watch out for and not be sucked into something that appears really good on the surface but isn't necessarily what they thought they were getting. So
that's right, and I suppose there is a bit of variance there, but it's all about service. So if they don't have the longevity of staff, if they don't have the seniority in staff, they can run a cheaper agency, but we find that is a very very quick fire to burn as well. And those, or
potentially they're not doing the regular inspections, or not necessarily taking all the steps they need to be taking.
Shortcuts. Maintenance takes weeks and weeks, so a dripping tap can often, explode into something much bigger. Tenants are upset applying for multiple properties because the person isn't getting back to them because there aren't the resources on the ground.
Yeah.
So, all of that sort of stuff filters down, and eventually you find, like anything, you get what you pay for, I guess. So asking the property manager what they get for that value and them justifying their fee, I think is a really good thing for them to do to clients as well.
Yeah, awesome. Are there any other questions that you think people should ask of a prospective property management firm before they sign an agreement with them?
Well, we have covered a lot today.
We have covered a lot, yeah. So we've probably covered everything, but I just thought if there's anything that we've forgotten.
No, well, I think also understanding when they're going to get paid each month, or whether that's twice monthly, and whether they have those options. Do they run rents every day? Again, a smaller agency simply may not have capacity to do that every day, which just produces an incorrect rent ledger in time that tenants get upset about. It might delay them getting paid on time if that person's sick. So again, what structure exists to make sure that those dates are hit all the time, money's receipted, and tenants feel comfortable in their tenancy.
And how important is it that the property manager that you go with actually specialises in the area that your investment property is located?
I think that kind of goes with the territory to some extent. I mean, we manage properties all over Adelaide, but they're all in different portfolios. So it just sort of makes sense for a property manager to know when bin day is, and to know what's going on at the local school and the zoning, and which street where the zoning ends.
That probably makes it easier to market properties as well when they become vacant, and also to be aware of what the market is doing in that particular area.
Yeah, is MBN connected? All those types of things are questions we get every day from tenants because they're really important to them. So for the property management agency to be able to just know those answers rather than it being specific to a property or something like that, being an area specialist, we would definitely recommend too, and any new clients will always come within that area portfolio and meet that manager.
Yeah, awesome. We are running out of time, Emma, but I'm going to just give you some updates because we do have a property investment workshop, which is a special 3-hour, very personalised workshop coming up on the 14th of August. There are, I think, about 3 or 4 spots left in that, so it's very almost closed at the moment. We've got a couple of spots left, so if you're interested in sitting down with me for 3 hours and nutting out your property investment strategy, then definitely come along to that. We also have a couple of seminars coming up for first home buyers and first time investors. So hop onto our website, risehigh.com.au, if you would like to come along to one of those free seminars. So Emma, thank you so much for coming along today and all your information. Is there any other tips or hints or anything else that you want to leave us with today, just to sort of wrap up today's session in terms of, the top 3 things to make sure that you're managing, like that your property manager is looking after?
Well, probably even one step earlier is buying the right property type for you as well, and that might be a conversation that they have with you, Marissa, and sort of takes in a range of considerations as to how long they're going to hold it, what their property goals are and why, and understanding the costs of some property types as well. So certainly we can help with that, but I know that's an area that you also chat to clients about.
I just love that you've thrown that in, because for me, that's just such a value add for a property manager to actually care about what your investment goals are and to actually, be willing to come and inspect a property before you buy it, to say, well, what would the rental appraisal be for this? What would you need to do to it if you wanted to lift the rent? So how good is that? Like leaving everyone with the little nugget of gold to make sure that you choose a property manager that's actually going to be in it with you for the long haul and care about your goals and dreams as well.
Definitely.
So thank you so much for tuning in with us today. We hope that this has been useful and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks.
Bye,
Melissa.
everyone.
Bye.